Right, so this is going to be tricky to film, but this is a tip on shadow gaps and 3D printing. So what I've got here is two pieces that are coming together, and the good news is that it's quite hard to see where they've actually connected. So there isn't like a sort of wonky gap here. If I take something without a shadow gap, what can happen is that you end up with something that has quite a noticeable uh, essentially transition between the two things. So if we take a look at the CAD, what you basically got is the main piece of the part and then a tiny little L-shaped cut taken out of it. And what that means is that I can take a thing like a file here and basically just file off any little imperfections which naturally do come from 3D printing, because this is far from injection molding quality. And not only does it allow me to make this really, really flush, but also visually it creates almost like a sort of honest transition between two parts. And I'm not an industrial designer, so I've just learnt this from industrial designers, but I guess almost the psychology is if you're honest about the tolerance between something and you create a shadow gap, the shadow, as the name suggests, it hides something, so it hides the inaccuracy and makes the transition between two parts a little less sort of visually awkward for your eyes. Also, if you wanted to, you can heat up PLA either in very hot boiling water or indeed give it a quick lick with the flame and then press it to something which is even quite inaccurate, and it will just conform and take up the tolerance perfectly. So for example, this is still in prototyping stage, but you can see that basically these gaps here are quite noticeable, and strangely it's counterintuitive, but if you additionally accentuate them, and you can see it down here, that's the shadow gap, just that little step there. Weirdly, at least I think, and I agree with a lot of industrial designers, that putting a shadow gap between something and accentuating the transition works better than trying to sort of conceal it just with tolerance. And so this isn't my first rodeo, and actually just picking this up, you can see that this is almost an extreme example of a shadow gap being used to accentuate something is actually for ventilation as well, so it's been made functional. And indeed, you can see it on here, the shadow gaps are very clear to see, and of course around here as well. Again, that just takes the tolerance issues out and makes it much more obvious. And indeed, things like this, I try to sort of accentuate a transition rather than hope that 3D printing with its limited accuracy is going to somehow make it perfect, which it just isn't. So, of course, there's an exception to the rule, and I had some fun doing this. And this is the absolutely no shadow gap at all. This is what we've dubbed internally as the jam sandwich. And so these red PCBs, printed circuit boards, for anyone who doesn't know, are usually very, very high tolerance and extremely flat. And so in contrast, the 3D print is usually a little bit all over the place. And so what I've done here is actually created something that I can print out, put flat on a piece of sandpaper, and then polish it at a high grit so that it's super flat, and then I can essentially mate it, put it together in really close proximity, and so it looks completely flush. Again, the sort of visual distraction as well of putting little how do I orientate this? There we go. So little 45-degree chamfers all the way around here. Again, this is to accentuate the fact that we've got a transition, rather than to, if you look really closely, these are not perfect all the way down here. So if you absolutely look down the edge, you will see little variations, but because you accentuate the transition, your eye is less aware of them. So I think it's a good one to Google around, and also just look at products around you. You'll see that when you do get something which, like this, again, you see shadow gaps there, and then actually when you see them, they're going very high tolerance, and you have an ultrasonic weld down here, they really have to go for it to get that perfect. So they wanted this to feel nice in the hand, this little battery pack, but it requires much more sophistication than this thing, which is just shadow gapped and can have a much more relaxed tolerance. So I think knowing that and combining the sort of the learnings from years of industrial designers can also help make your 3D prints feel less visually imperfect, even though it's basically the same tolerances and the same thing, but you're working with the medium effectively. Okay, so just getting you a little bit of shadow gap here. So this is a shadow gap, as are that and that shadow gaps. And these are achieved by taking a look at this. If we look at this edge, you can see that basically these have just been inset and cut away from the main body. So that runs all the way around, and this face is slightly more sacrificial. There we go.